Hello, everybody. My name is Bo Pinkham. I'm with the International Council of Helplines as a board member at large. A little bit about myself. I work with the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline currently, based out of New York City. I am in Iowa City, Iowa. So Big Ten country representing for you people in Pennsylvania. And also, my prior job was with a local crisis center here in Iowa City, where I was director of crisis intervention services for roughly 4 or 5 years. So, first of all, I just want to thank you all for taking this journey with me. I'm really excited to hear that a state like Pennsylvania and its DV services is moving into the online emotional support realm. It is sometimes not to mince words, it's sometimes a painful transition. These services are very different from other services that you might be used to providing, but they're so necessary, especially in 2020, in the year of COVID, with more people staying at home and accessing services that they might not have thought that they needed to access before. So, just a little bit about this training. It's based on best practice standards found in the International Council for Helplines Online Emotional Support Accreditation Standards Manual, which was most recently revised in 2020, and the Lifeline Crisis Chat Manual for Chat Counselors, which was revised in 2016. Special thanks goes to the Agora Crisis Center in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Community Crisis Services and Food Bank in Iowa City, Iowa, for their help and willingness to share the content for this training. We'd also like to acknowledge the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline for some of their contributions. We also used a very valuable and new to us resource called Tech Safety for some chat and text best practices as related to domestic violence. And you're going to see information from there interspersed throughout this entire training. Let's go over the agenda a little bit. We're pretty jam-packed for the next 3 weeks, but I also have a tendency to talk pretty fast, which is a good thing that this is being recorded. I will try to make as much time for questions as possible. You can either vocalize or you can throw it in the chat, and Denise or someone else will be able to read it out loud to me if I manage to talk over your question. If things are getting tight in my kind of own internal timeline, I might reserve the right to table questions and either address them at the end, or we will pile them into an email and I can just email out the answers to the questions that are still outstanding. But as you can see, we go from welcome and introductions, which is where we're at currently. Today, most likely, we're going to be covering the overview of chat and texting helpline services, which is kind of a landscape analysis of what those services look like. We'll also talk about software and platform considerations. That's where you're going to hear me opine about the various softwares that you have available to you. And I'm very opinionated, so get ready for, I promise not to use colorful language, but I will probably vocalize some frustrations that you all might find as you start setting up these programs for yourself. And then if we can manage it for today, we will get to the text and chat process as well. That's probably where, if we get to that, we'll either end off getting through it completely or maybe midway through. We'll just see how far we can get today. And since we do have 3 sessions of this, as questions do come through, we could always tweak this, add some slides for the next few training sessions. We'll update your documents for you and address that as it comes. I already did my welcome and introductions, and since there's, I think, 90 of you or so, I don't need to, let's not get emotionally attached. I don't need to hear from every single one of you. I'm sure you're great, though. So let's dive right into what an overview of chat and texting helpline services looks like. So when we talk about online emotional support, we're going to talk about 2 different kinds of things. The main one that you might think of, and actually this one is kind of transitioning out, but is still very prevalent. So we still talk about it, but online chat, which is browser-based platforms where a survivor can connect to you directly through a program's website. This can also be, I'm going to highlight that there can also be app-based messaging. We don't see that nearly as much in the field because developing your own app is expensive, and working with existing messaging apps, which are usually controlled by large corporations, is next to impossible. So what most likely is happening is there's going to be an embed of some kind of routing software in your website that helps you do chat. So they will click a link. The survivor clicks a link on the program's website. This is ideal for survivors since the conversation stays in the online chat box. They don't have to worry about deleting messages out of an app or anything like that. There is a chance, depending on how the software works, that that conversation is cached somewhere. But most softwares now that you're going to be working with that develop chat services do not do that. So it's pretty much all carried out in another cloud somewhere that you don't control. And then there's also another one that you might be thinking about, mobile-based messaging, which is texting. This is a dedicated texting service platform, and it's just exactly what you think. The survivor texts into their messaging app on their smartphone, maybe a tablet, but most likely a smartphone. And then you receive it and deal with it through your usually web-based or platform-based software. In this training, you're going to hear me use chat and text interchangeably, basically with absolutely no rhyme or reason, just because that's how long I've been in the industry. It's all kind of one big morass to me. You might also hear me slip up. Again, I've been in crisis intervention for quite a long time, so I might use the term call. I actually mean chat and text. So if I do delineate between calls and chats and text, I will do so as clearly as possible. When we talk about online emotional support, I like to clarify the roles that we're talking about. We have used the term survivor for people who are accessing your domestic violence services. These are the people who are utilizing the text or chat service. Another general term for them would be clients, although some agencies don't like to use that term. And then advocate is the term that we have for trained volunteers or staff who are dispensing the resources and the counseling that you provide at your agency. Obviously, this is all going to be changed on your end, depending on what your internal culture is and what you like to label your staff, your volunteers, and the people who utilize your services. But for the purposes of this training, this is what we're going to use. A little bit of history and the evolution of what online emotional support has looked like. And it's actually pretty nascent. It's 2010 is when Contact USA, which is the old branding of the International Council for Helplines. You might hear me slip up and use that because I've been a board member for a while and it's only been International Council for Helplines for a couple of months. So they started a nationwide pilot called crisischat.org in 2010. That was a very slow rollout. It wasn't 24/7. It had a few partner centers across the country. It was really just evening hours, which are usually peak hours for online emotional support usage, at least in the general crisis field. In 2013, CUSA partnered with the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline to provide an expanded crisis suicide prevention service. That means that the pilot basically grew. It grew in hours and it grew in the scope of how many agencies were providing the chat service nationally. The service is now operated wholly by Lifeline, as Lifeline Crisis Chat is its branding, and there's a single point of entry there through the Lifeline portal. The history of crisis text services is even shorter, and nationally, we generally think of Crisis Text Line. They've been the leader in that space since roughly 2014, 2015, maybe a little earlier. They have their own platform. They're not affiliated with the Lifeline at all or International Council for Helplines, and they have been growing their service through a national network of volunteers since then. As chat or text has expanded, many organizations have created their own chat and text services. This is actually pretty interesting in that this is one of the few national networks that came before a group of local networks, if that makes any sense to you. So there were chat programs before 2010, but they were very rare and very small in scope. And generally, the national programs have kind of kickstarted the push and vocalization of need on the local level for local chat and text points of contact. Which is kind of what we're seeing here with Pennsylvania and the domestic violence services. But there's been many other states, and if not just states, local municipalities and large cities and groups of counties who have decided that they need not a national program, but at least a state level online emotional support program or something similar. And just a little update for how COVID-19 has interacted with these services. We're seeing an increase in chat programs within the domestic violence community in order to increase accessibility for survivors. So again, what you're going through is absolutely going to be a little painful, but it's also necessary, and you're going to see that need mirrored in other states and localities as well. So let's get down to brass tacks. Why do people use chat or text? So many people find it easier to discuss difficult subjects via online platforms. And by online, we don't always think of text as online, but that's kind of how we group it up with everything else. It's easier to interact with. It's also safer for a person to vocalize in this manner rather than kind of out loud. And so it's just what I can tell you is that I was part of the initial push nationally to start this national pilot from 2010. And what we learned very rapidly is that It wasn't that we built it and then, organically a need kind of arose or a demand arose for that kind of service. We built it and we already tapped into a bedrock of demand that was always there. There were a ton of people who had never reached out to any kind of crisis or help service because they just did not want to use the phone or go to an in-person session, or in very specific cases they didn't have the ability to do so. Maybe they had some kind of mobility issue that limited their access to services. Maybe they had some kind of other thing going on that just literally they could not talk on the phone. And so demand was huge, and it was always huge from the very beginning. And a lot of that was just because there were a lot of people who just preferred this method of communication over all others. It's also, and this is probably comes without saying, it's obviously the preferred method of communication for younger generations. You can ask an entire class of teenagers how often they actually use their phones as phones, and it might be 0%. I'd wager on that rather than any other number. And if you just do a little internal audit, when's the last time you actually enjoyed getting a phone call? I don't. I hate my phone calls, and every time my phone buzzes, it scares me. So it's just kind of the more commonplace way that especially younger people enjoy reaching out. We'll talk about youth and working with youth, which most of you all as agencies working in DV, you're probably at least passingly familiar with kind of the trends that you see in youth, but they're a pretty fascinating demographic as far as online emotional support goes. We talk about shyness or anxiety. That's definitely a thing. Hearing or speech issues. I mentioned that, but to put a finer point on that, it's never been a better time for people with hearing or hearing loss or other such issues to interact with agencies and help providers. It's been phenomenal for them. There's still some barriers there and some kind of cultural issues, so it's not quite perfect, but it's definitely better than it was even like a decade or so ago. Proximity to others. This is very important for your services, obviously, right? Having worked with other domestic violence providers, you're advertising your services where, their partners can't see what's going on. So like the inside of bathroom stalls and stuff like that. It's a lot easier for people to pick up their phone and text a service provider than it is to make a call and try to squirrel away time away from them. It's not perfect, right? Because we all know how abusers function. And so they could maybe get access to phone records and say, wow, you really sent like 30 texts or, even more than that, 500 texts in one night to this number, which I don't recognize. What is that? But it's generally a little easier for people to obfuscate what they're doing from an abusive partner. But on top of that, going away from just abuse, generally, youth also don't like to maybe let their parents know what's going on in their lives, so they are able to do it surreptitiously. And also, I really want to call attention in a public place, they don't want the conversation heard. In contrast to what we found with phone services, which you might be more comfortable and familiar with, excuse me, people are texting, especially from all over. We'll get youth texting from, literally their high school classroom or like on their way home on the bus and stuff like that. Or literally they'll mention that they're talking to their friends right now because they're in a friend group, but they all have their phones open, right? And so everyone's on their phones and just kind of chatting amiably while they're talking with you. I already mentioned the intimate partner domestic violence situations. I mean, that's obviously why you're starting one of the many reasons you're starting these programs. There is a perceived anonymity versus calling. Calls can be traced, is kind of the general conception, which is true. We say perceived, though, because when you really get down to brass tacks, it's 2020. There is no such thing as anonymity anymore, but there is the perception of it. It's easier to feel like no one's going to track you or no one really knows who you are if you're logging into a website with kind of a random user handle or something like that, or if you're on your own phone and kind of sending out a text message to some faceless person. So there's a perception of anonymity. Again, with the softwares that you put into place and the programs that you develop, you will most likely have access to all the information that you need to. We will talk about how there are some barriers there on the online end, especially with chat compared to text and calls, that requires you to jump through a few more hoops, but we'll get to that when we get there. And then also there's a fear of being traced by illegal immigrants or in generally in 2020, just anyone who feels like they're part of a marginalized population. I don't have any statistics about this because obviously, as you know, statistics kind of come a few years down the road. But the people who are engaging in protests and other civil rights movements currently have that fear as well. Three large ones, and then we mentioned COVID here as well. We already talked about younger population, but we have a little bit of statistics. These are cribbed from various centers across the country doing their own kind of research into what their demographics look like, and then also what Lifeline has given us as well. So 40% of the people who access Lifeline Crisis Chat are under the age of 20. That's amazing. That is a large majority minority of people. And then stretching that out, 31% are under the age of 30. Again, there's depending on how you break your demographics down, and having worked at an individual center, every single funder wants your demographics in a slightly different way, which is maddening, but when that's what we roll with when we want to get funding. Under age 30 demographic is the most important piece for online emotional support. Pretty much the vast majority of people that you talk to on these will be in that age group. That is, of course, this is across all of crisis intervention. When you do this for DV, as we're seeing, I think I have this right, less and less people under the age of 30 are married or in committed relationships, which obviously you can not be in one of those things and still be part of an abusive situation, but it's probably a little less likely. So your people might trend a little older than this. It'll actually be really fascinating to see what Pennsylvania's demographics look like statewide once you get all these pieces into place. And again, just to reiterate, this is one of the text and chat is one of the few ways that the younger people feel like they're really comfortable reaching out, which has been interesting and also very tough to deal with, kind of as a quote unquote industry, as we started to get things going about a decade ago. People who are having thoughts of suicide, I feel comfortable telling you that even though your branding might be very specifically for domestic violence, you all know that suicide is comorbid with a whole bunch of other pieces, domestic violence included, right? So this is just to point out that, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but 80% and higher are answering yes to a pre-survey question about suicide. Are you having thoughts of suicide? At least on my old program, and we had a pretty good rate of usage on our phone lines as well as our chat and text. It was roughly like 5 to 10%, even with suicide-specific branding for the program. So people are much more likely to talk about suicide in these online emotional support systems than they are over the phone or in person. To the point where it's difficult for some of your staff and volunteers to maintain a level of non-burnout when they're doing consistent chat and text service. And we'll talk about that at some point during this training, how to kind of manage that burnout, because it's a very real thing, especially with OES systems. There's also a ton of first-time disclosures online. LGBTQ coming out for the first time, that's still definitely a trend. I would say one of the few bright spots is that we've come a long way in North America. We obviously have a tremendous length to go, especially with the T and Q parts. The sexual identities is getting closer to kind of inclusivity, but gender identity, gender questioning is still a major concern for those communities, and so a lot of people are still kind of carrying that with them and maybe not out to all or anybody in their life, but they do feel comfortable disclosing that in the online forum with you. So just be on the lookout for that. Obviously, sexual abuse and molestation is a big thing. Concurrent maybe with domestic violence as well, but sexual abuse specifically, childhood trauma. We'll talk about trauma-informed care, I believe. Which you all are at least should be familiar with. If not, you will be at some point. That comes up quite a bit. And then bullying, especially for those youth populations, obviously is disclosed quite often. I haven't told anyone this, but these people at school, and obviously a lot of those can kind of go hand in hand, right? Bullying because LGBTQ, we know that happens frequently, which is very unfortunate. So you might get both in one contact. And then just to reiterate, with COVID-19 trends for this year, we're seeing survivors in abusive situations. They cannot safely use their phone. Maybe their partner worked away from the house, so they maybe had some time to themselves during the day. That's no longer the case with a lot of states quarantining or whatnot. They cannot leave their house, and so they have to switch to a chat or text service if they do want to try to access those services. Some trends we're seeing with chat. I mentioned this, but I really do want to reiterate. It's thank God y'all are doing this, because there are capacity issues at the U.S. national level. The demand is insane. It's far outweighing the supply of helpers that we have nationally in the online emotional support realm, whether through crisis text line, the National Suicide Prevention Line, or even your local services. It's tremendously concerning for me. It's why I'm really glad to be doing trainings like this. We still don't know what kind of model would work best. We also see, and you might be familiar with this with your own clientele on your more traditional services, but people don't pick and choose what's right for them, so to speak. They will kind of just shotgun blast out their needs to a lot of different online services, right? So they're going from crisis text line to Lifeline to a local service and back again, which we don't want to discourage, because people need to find what's right for them, but that really inflates demand across all services. So either there might be some kind of breaking point where we really compartmentalize everything. You all have heard about 988 probably, so that's going to be a thing that comes down the pipeline next year and into the year after. So there might be something going on with that. Obviously, I can't talk too much about that since I work at Lifeline, but I can let slip that we know about as much as you do right now. And it's really going to be dependent, as everything is, on funding through Congress and working with local providers as well. Text or chats cover more tense subject matter, and they come up quicker in the conversation. Oh, Zoe, so okay, I could talk about 988 a little bit. So basically, Congress has passed a measure through the FCC that the number 988 is going to be the designated national suicide and mental health number. It's going to be similar to 911, but instead of connecting you to a local PSAP, public service access point, it will most likely connect you to a provider of some kind who can hopefully de-escalate. So consider it like a national crisis line. We at Lifeline, putting my Lifeline hat on for a quick sec, we've always said that even though we have suicide in our name, our intent is to serve all people wherever they're at, whether they have suicidality or not. It is a great idea. Again, a lot of great ideas get passed and then maybe are not adequately funded. And this will be a pain point nationally, because it's going to be a large scale change. Right now, how a lot of these national networks work, if any of you have worked with the National Domestic Violence Line, I actually don't know if they are spread out across a national network of agencies, but Lifeline certainly is. It's a lot of local providers that all banded together and also provide national support. They usually have catchment areas based on geography, but there's also a ton of agencies that just take whatever calls want to be sent to them, which is also cool. That might have to change with 988 though, because that means that the states, especially since it's going to be similar to how 911 operates, are going to be much more heavily involved in what the 988 number really means for them and what they feel comfortable doing. Okay, cool. It is a great idea. Zoe. I'm probably a little too jaded for this work, honestly, but I think we were really happy to see it passed, and we're excited to see what the future holds. But when in doubt, always write your Congress people. Just shameless plug for that. So yeah, going back to when we talk about intense subject matter coming up quicker in the conversation, this is super, super important for you all starting these services. I mentioned I mentioned suicide and some of the other first-time disclosures, but there's going to be very, very heavy subject matter, which obviously all of you are very used to running DV programs of some kind. But when we looked at it in the overall crisis intervention field, we noticed very much that people were disclosing suicide thoughts much quicker and much more bluntly than they were in, say, like a crisis call. And so that impact on how you do things in the DV world is going to be really fascinating to watch, right? I don't know how much of an elaborate dance you have to do with your callers to really get to the nitty gritty of what their situation is. But obviously, with the stigma of domestic violence and all the kind of intricacies there, maybe there are a bunch of people who, know why they're calling, but don't really get down to brass tacks until they feel comfortable after you've developed a rapport. Conversely, with your online systems, you may get people giving this all of giving all this to you very much up front. I want to point you to a thing called the online disinhibition effect, which you can look up on Wikipedia. It's got a lot of peer-reviewed research on it. And it's literally the fact that if psychologically, if we have a screen in front of us of any kind, or a different method of communication than the ones that we're usually used to, which is most likely phones and in-person conversation, we are much more likely to be open and honest about our opinions on things and what our needs are. So for the case of the national services and online emotional support services, that means, again, people are bluntly saying within like the first few back and forths on these systems that they are having thoughts of suicide. So for an example, when I first started doing crisis calls way back in 2002, I wouldn't have that many suicide related calls in general, but oftentimes it would take 15 to 20 minutes before they were comfortable really giving me the information of like, now that we talked about it, I need to let you know I've really been thinking about killing myself. Meanwhile, when I first started chat, I would start to chat up and I'd be like, hey, this is Bo, how are you doing today? Oh, I'm making it through, but I think I might kill myself with a knife tonight. Like second sentence in, right? And it floored me as someone who's been doing that work for quite a while. It's very tough to deal with if you're not used to something like that. If you're used to doing that kind of elaborate dance, you suddenly don't know what to do with yourself when they just kind of drop it right there. There's certainly strengths to it as well, and we'll cover those in a bit, I believe. If not, I'll circle back to this. But this is also, by the way, why you get on Facebook and learn that like your uncle might be slightly racist. This is the effect that's giving you that. So thanks, online disinhibition, for completely changing our worldview in a lot of things. But it's not only fascinating for you professionally and for you all developing these services, but I would definitely recommend just reading up on this because online disinhibition is going to affect you personally. If not now, it will eventually. It is one of the key psychological influencers of the modern age. And I absolutely recommend that you dive into it in some way. Even if you just read the Wikipedia article, it's fascinating. We mentioned texts and chats have their own unique communication style and etiquette. We put this under trends because that kind of communication is just constantly evolving. If you've ever spent some time on even in Facebook, it permeates there and some other social media, but if you ever go to a place like Reddit or, other online communities, it's like you're entering a very different culture, and it's because you are. It's a different culture with its own communication style, an etiquette that might be very opaque and hard to penetrate unless you really, really dive in and get used to it. We talk about people, we make jokes, but it's not so much jokes anymore that people can communicate entirely in emojis and memes. We'll talk about emojis in a bit, but that's absolutely true. When we talk about youth, right? If you ever take a look at youth to youth text conversations, I'm 36, not that old. Hopefully you can please tell me I'm not that old in the chat, but I don't understand it. I don't understand half of what they're saying. And again, it confuses and frightens me. And the fact that, I'm supposed to be a service provider helping these folk when I can't really understand what they're saying, it might as well be a foreign language, right? And that really just says to you that you as agencies have to do your level best to catch up to these trends, to do your best to do your own research and be like, okay, what are we seeing in our chat and text platforms that we have had to ask for clarification more often than not, or that our volunteers or staff have come to us and just be like, I have no idea what this person meant by this. I don't know what GG means or G2G or anything like that. And then you have to look it up, find a trusted source for that, and then kind of distribute that information internally. Also, what's important to know, you see way more technical glitches happen in chat and text than you do with phone and in person. Obviously, in person is not going to have a lot of technical glitches, but if you do have in-person services that are moving to a kind of a telehealth system, that could pop up. Texting, You would think it would be glitch free, but carrier to carrier interactions, right, can be very fraught. And there's a lot of FCC guidelines with texting that you'll eventually have to jump through. You have to make sure that people say yes so that they give consent to getting more text from you. If somebody puts stop in all capital letters into this text conversation, generally that means that the conversation automatically ends. A personal example is some of you may have heard about the derecho that came through Iowa, Nebraska, parts of Illinois as well. It absolutely affected my area. We lost some trees or whatnot. I had to text my local internet service provider, and I got frustrated with them. In one of my frustrated texts, which probably reflects on me as a person, but it's too late for that. I put stop in all capital letters without knowing what I was doing. And then I had to file a complaint because they stopped sending me texts and they wouldn't respond to my follow-ups. And it turns out it was me being an idiot because I texted all capital letters stop to them. So sorry, Mediacom. But it's just important to know. And then obviously technical glitches happen quite a bit with chat. Whenever you have anything embedded in a browser of any kind, right? There's going to be glitches that happen on the client's end. You're not going to be able to account for every single kind of platform, right? We recommend Chrome, and blah blah blah. You might have that on your website, but you can't control if somebody's coming at you from, say, a Safari on window on their mobile phone, right? A majority of chat users are not on a desktop PC. We kind of have this idea that people who use chat are on PCs, but PCs actually pretty rare because pretty expensive, right? Even these days, laptops more so even. So when we think of chat users and we think of computer users, the new computer is a smartphone or tablet, most likely a smartphone. That's important to keep in mind when you talk to software providers, and we'll cover that a little later on in the conversation as well. So let's go into some differences between phone and chat. Again, I make the assumption that most of you all, if not all of you, have some kind of phone service. If not a direct crisis line or DV helpline, maybe some kind of resource and referral thing, but probably this is more your traditional comfort zone is a phone service. So the differences that you need to see is texts and chats last longer than calls. The average chat's going to be 2 to 3 times longer than the average helpline call. I don't know what your average call length is, but I would double or triple it at minimum for when you start implementing these services. Effective chats can last 45 minutes to an hour. We use the term effective. That's very broad, right? There's various measures of effectiveness and success. And that's going to be kind of program specific, agency specific. So we'll let you define that. But when we say effective chats on our end, it's usually, have we identified the issue? Have we empathized with the person? Have we shared that pain, shared those feelings? And then have we gotten to a process of collaborative problem solving where they feel comfortable ending the conversation, or at least more comfortable than they did at the beginning of the conversation? Again, we talked about first-time disclosures, but I really want to hammer that point home. You're going to get a lot of conversation from people who've never talked about this with anyone else, especially young people. It's first time many young people have been utilized a service at all of any kind. First time they've really been able to express their pain beyond maybe their friends network or even more. Oh, I do want to circle back. So if you're starting a text program, texts take even longer than chat usually. It's much more likely to be triple your average helpline call than double. So I would account for that as well. I will say personally, and this is from my old agency, so you take it with a grain of salt because that was the way we did things. Our average call length was roughly about 15, 20 minutes. Our average chat length was roughly 50 minutes to an hour, and our average text length was roughly 110 minutes, like 70 minutes to 80 minutes. And when I start saying those numbers out loud, that's where administrators and supervisors' eyes start popping, right? Because that's an incredible length of time to keep, what is already probably a very stretched staff busy on one interaction. We're going to talk about what taking multiple interactions looks like, and it's that kind of cultural change varies from agency to agency. So you're going to find the most effective method for your agency. But it is good to know, just from an administrative standpoint, that these users will be engaged in much longer conversations, which kind of trickles down to everything from quality assurance to scheduling to doing year-long evaluations of what your productivity is, all that fun stuff. So it's good to keep in mind. Text and chat visitors, again, remember chat visitors are going to be on their cell phones more often than not. So it's kind of interchangeable. They're going to be multitasking, right? You shouldn't picture your average user as just being on a couch and just like intently staring at their phone, right? They might be out in the community. Again, I reference high school students who are literally in class texting us, which, like, first of all, teacher, please take their phones away. But hey, it's the year 2020 and they literally can't because they're at home. So that might be cropping up for you as well. But there's going to be a lot of multitasking. This really lends itself to why the average length might be longer, right? Because they're going to be doing other things besides just talking to you, so their responses might be a little delayed. It also means that they might have trouble focusing directly on your conversation, which is super frustrating as a provider, but honestly, one that you have very little control over. Now, you can obviously, depending on how you want to manage your program, you might be pretty strict on saying, like, hey, if we don't hear from you within a few minutes, we might have to end this conversation and go to the next person, especially depending on what your volume looks like overall. You might have to be a lot stricter than you would initially feel comfortable with, right? You wouldn't just hang up on a caller usually, but this is a very different kind of program, right? You have to juggle a lot more things. So just keep that in mind. Again, it also just physically takes longer for people to type messages. I really, you don't have any control over this, but again, when you start talking to like your board or other funders or whatnot, and they're like, wow, your numbers for this are, lower than we were expecting, or like, I don't get why text numbers are lower than phone numbers because I text way more often than calls. This is something that you need to provide, right? Like, average out how long it takes to say something out loud versus, typing it up, even with the awesome two-thumbed method that I've never been able to actually get down on your smartphone. It's a degree greater or more, right? So that's naturally going to filter into just how the chat or text goes. It's going to take a lot longer. Active rescues when suicide is involved are more time consuming. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but they generally just take longer. With text, not so much, but with chat, generally you have an IP address to work with and not like an actual phone number. Also, especially for UDV agencies, I could just say this, you probably have hopefully a pretty good working relationship with your local PSAP and your other law enforcement providers, and you might have a good flow locked down with them because you know people there, you can reach out to them, you just know how things go. This is going to be a new world for you and maybe for them. I've done online active rescues quite a bit for the last decade or so, and in the year 2020, a lot of our centers still have to kind of run through with these PSAP operators exactly what an IP address is, how to contact the legal compliance number of an internet service provider, and all that fun stuff. It takes a lot more work on your end, and it's just something to keep in mind, because again, just like with that average length of call, that's going to filter into kind of your productivity of supervisors if you have your supervisors doing this. Or it might say, well, we have a large base rate of people who need active intervention, which obviously as a DV agency, you're not going to be sending active rescue nearly as often, I would imagine. Again, that's probably going to be program specific, but it's just going to take time. And whenever anything takes a longer amount of time, it's going to filter down into pretty much every aspect of your program. So it's good to be mindful of. And then text or chat staff can be taking more than one text or chat at a time. Again, this is going to be decided by each organization here. We say at International Council of Helplines, Lifeline and other agencies back us up on this. Best practice is no more than 2 or texts or chats at once. When you get into the 3 or more level, that's when corner cases become not corner cases, right? Where you'll have 2 very high risk, intense chats or texts that demand a lot of attention, and then you'll also have this third person that maybe not be as high as risk, but they're still a client of yours and they still kind of deserve as much time as you can give them. So we like to limit people to 2 texts or chats at once. We also say that staff or volunteers should demonstrate a level of competency prior to taking more than 1 text or chat at a time. That can be anything from an internal quality assurance program that you have where it's like, okay, we'll put you on 1 chat at a time for your first set of shifts. We'll kind of see how those go. see how your comfort level is, and then we can start working you towards two chats at once, if everything looks like it's squared away. I will say personally, the most effective programs that I've seen generally take two chats at once, if only just to work with the volume that you might see. Again, I mentioned how large demand is. It's a very real concern. Obviously, what Pennsylvania is doing here is kind of new, so we don't really know what demand will be. But I would always guess with these online emotional support systems that demand's going to be high. So if you haven't thought about taking multiple contacts at once, I absolutely would encourage you to start talking about it internally. Do maybe some surveys of your current helpers who you think are going to be part of this online emotional support system you develop. It's a very real thing. It's a cultural change that a lot of centers have managed, but I'm not going to say it's not painful. We all want to intently focus on one person at a time, because that's kind of why we got into this work. We want to treat every human being with the love and care that we want to give them. But then we run into the reality of there's just not enough of us, right? If everyone under the sun got training in high school in empathy and counseling, and were able to do this kind of work from the get-go, maybe we could manage one person. But unfortunately, that's just not the case. So we might have to double up. I would absolutely recommend doubling up. But again, your organizational practice, and if you don't happen to have a lot of demand magically, maybe you can manage with just one person per contact. It'll be up to you. Some other differences between phone and chat. The subject matter I've already kind of covered, but again, a lot of disclosures, a lot of very high level stuff. You're obviously not new to intense subject matter, obviously, but depending on how things go with your service, again, you might see a lot of comorbidity, right? We're not just talking about domestic violence, we're talking about health issues, we're talking about COVID, we're talking about suicide thoughts, right? All that stuff. So it's just good to know. You're going to have a complete lack of auditory cues. This is really, again, one of the largest pain points if you're transitioning a already dedicated workforce of volunteers or staff to also integrating these online emotional support systems. I went through this process. I wasn't actually managerial at the time, but I just knew I was part of a leadership group at my center. And we had a lot of, very ingrained 30 to 40-year volunteers or staff, on our phone lines who were awesome. But when we started setting up chat and text, they don't have auditory cues to work with suddenly. They don't have a lot of the things that they've been used to working with, right? And so it was a completely new world for them. So a lack of auditory cues should not be downplayed. You do not have nearly as much information to work with online emotional support systems than you do with phone calls or in-person contacts. That's kind of made up magically by the fact that they're going to drop the subject matter and what they really want to talk about earlier in the call, right? So you do have at least that. But that's more of just kind of a bouncing off point of how you think, what the subject matter of the call might be. Okay, you mentioned suicide. We need to talk about suicide. You mentioned domestic violence. Obviously, we're going to talk about that. But you don't have those little cues of, how do I think this conversation is going? Are they responding okay to my skills use? Are they, I don't like to use the term feeling better, because I think that's a tough road to hoe. When you're contacting a helpline, better is very is tough, right? But am I getting any indicators that they think this is helpful at all? Are they getting frustrated with me? You don't have any of that. You have to ask for clarity a lot more. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But you really just can't assess their feelings, the risk of suicide, violence, without the tone of voice. It's very tough. So you have to clarify. You have to look for the meanings underneath a lot of things. You might find yourself doing more question asking and online emotional support than you do with your other services. That's natural, right? Think back to the last time you had a miscommunication by text. If you haven't, let me know what your secret is, because I miscommunicate with people via text all the time, right? Work emails, text to my wife, text to my friends. We don't have tone of voice to work with, so people take what you say and they put their own internal spin on it, and that's going to be the same for these online emotional support systems. It's something you have to bake into the system from the get-go. is let your volunteers know, hey, this is going to be very different. Sorry, volunteers or staff. We've mentioned the style and etiquette. We'll talk about that, but it's just good to know. It's not to say that every call and face-to-face contact has like a similar demeanor. All of those can be very different, but more so just there's a style to text and chats that is very unique in communication. Again, this is probably something you've encountered, especially if you've, texted a youth or if you have kids or something like that. You know that they just talk differently through text and like these online services than they do face to face, right? Very few people are saying LOL out loud. If you're one of those few people, please stop. No one wants you to do that. No, I'm kidding. You live your best life, but it just looks very different. It looks very foreign when you see a list of emojis and you're just like, I understand half of those. Why did you send me an elephant, Michael? I don't know what the elephant means. But it's something that you're going to have to rapidly catch up to because you're going to see that in these kinds of services. And then especially going back to kind of what we were talking about earlier, just a few slides back, the long pauses. So people take longer to type and text, right? We know that. But we don't know the reason for that. Are they literally just a slow typer or texter? That could be. I'm not the quickest texter, right? I still swipe with a Y instead of an I, and that's, I get made fun of for that because it's super inefficient. I don't care because I don't have the double thumb method down. But they could also be distracted. They could be crying really hard, right? Which, if you were on a phone call with them, you would understand and you would give them that requisite amount of time to kind of like process what they're going through right now. But you don't know if they're crying, right? You have to ask that maybe if it's been 3 minutes and they've been very good about contacting you pretty quickly after each message that you send. You can point out your observation of long pauses and you can ask directly in a caring way what's causing the delay. Like, hey, I'm feeling a lot of pause, maybe some hesitation on your end. I'm wondering what's going on. Is this is this conversation affecting you? Is it drawing up something? Is there something else going on in the background that we need to address? And when we talk about concluding calls, you can use that like, there's been a lot of long pauses. We've been talking about 45 minutes. I'm wondering if something else is coming up and we need to kind of table this conversation, or I can get you those resources I mentioned, then we can kind of conclude it here. But there are definitely going to be just a lot of long pauses that you will have to ask clarity about eventually. So let's talk about good text and chat etiquette. There's obviously no standardized good netiquette, which, I've obviously just aged myself because I use the term netiquette, and that's not really a thing anymore. But there are some good rules of thumb that you can follow when you design your program to tell your volunteers and staff about just kind of what the best way that they could communicate online and be a helpful provider while also sounding kind of human. So one of those ways is you always want to utilize correct punctuation and you want to minimize spelling errors. Spelling errors will happen. So if you catch the error, just correct it in the next message. You don't always have to correct them. I would correct if you think at any point the errors could change the meaning or tone of what you sent. That does happen occasionally. Correct punctuation is also just a way for you to kind of distinguish yourself from kind of the way they interact with everyone else online. And we'll talk about kind of the importance of that in a little bit because we're going to talk about boundaries. You want to refrain from using all capitals. You could use them for emphasis on a single word sometimes, especially if you're trying to empathize with, something that's, truly awful or whatnot. But it could be perceived as shouting and considered rude. It's just also generally not the most professional thing. So we tell you to refrain from them. Use the slang, emotions, and emoticons, emojis appropriately. And I'm going to talk about emojis in a little bit, but when we talk about slang and emotions, we want to make sure that we are mirroring language as much as possible. You don't want to just throw slang out that you don't know if the client understands or not. So generally, you're going to have them kind of break that seal, and like they're like starting to throw out some words and stuff that you might be familiar with, either because you had to research them or because you're just an online person and you understand them. And then you can start integrating them, but generally you don't want to be using more slang than the visitor. You want to be using it sparingly, and again, generally just to make sure that you're being empathetic with them in an appropriate manner. Also, don't use any less common emoticons or emojis. They may not know what was intended, take it out of context, or be offended. Here's a nice large group of slang and emojis. So this is the slang that you see, a lot of acronyms. Really, if you're throwing out ROTFLMAO in a conversation with a client on your help service, probably do some self-reflection as to why you thought that was appropriate at all. But yeah, don't do that. But some other ones that are good to know: AFK is very important, just so that you know that people are not going to be responding to you. That's one that you can use, like, are you AFK or something like that, or are you going AFK? BF for boyfriend, GF for girlfriend, that comes up quite a bit. Obviously, for you all in DV services, that's something that you want to know. SI for self-injury, that's part of kind of the self-injuries community acronym for it. You might see that quite a bit. WTF, I think we're all pretty familiar with that. And ZOMG actually does come up pretty frequently, and that's a sarcastic, oh my God. So, and then we move on to the emoticons. You're familiar with a lot of these. The ones that probably I would point out is that the heartbreak one is still gets a lot of traction, and some people might not quite realize what that is when they first see it. No purpose for me to circle this, except it's just absolutely my favorite emoticon. I just love that. I use it pretty frequently. So I want to go back to kind of this point. Like, when is this good, when is this bad? And the answer is it really depends. Just like you treat every call with care and consideration as kind of its own unique, this is how I'm interacting with this person, you're going to be the same with these online emotional support contacts, right? There might be clients that start using emoticons from the very beginning, and you might feel comfortable throwing in a smiley face or something, or a frowny face when you're trying to empathize with stuff. Especially with younger people, emoticons can kind of come across very well, right? They're used to those being thrown in as a way to kind of qualify a statement or give a statement more context. An example is, I remember some teenager was talking to me about how they were really excited. They were happy that their boyfriend broke up with them. So it's like, my boyfriend broke up with me, smiley face. If it wasn't for that smiley face, I really wouldn't understand the context of that, right? And even then, I needed to ask some clarity, because emoticons can also be sarcastic, right? That's the joy of online communication, is we just don't know. But at the very least, I felt I had a stronger framework to work with that statement than I did if I just didn't have the emoticon at all. But you want to be very, very careful with these, right? Most of the people who are help seeking online are going to be very aware of your use of these, just like they'd be aware of your tone of voice over a call or an in person, right? So if they start see you overusing these, they're going to think that you're not really taking the time to really like understand what's going on with them. They might see it as flippant. Even if you're only using like frowny faces and stuff like that, they might just see it as you're not taking the care. Same with these slang terms. Again, don't use any of these. But another thing is, you just need to make sure that they understand what these terms mean. And also, if you're starting to rely on these to shorten your sentences or whatnot, like, it's not going to come across as professional, and it's going to kind of blur boundaries. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. So Maria says, the trust for me is that I'm happy to see this since I'm not very familiar with them. Yeah, again, we're kind of dating ourselves by calling them emoticons and not emojis. And we don't actually have the emojis here because those are a little harder to integrate. But we all know what emojis look like by now, hopefully, or just at least a few of them. And they just crop up more and more in online communication. You just have to be aware. So again, we want to avoid those abbreviations or acronyms as much as possible. Again, some people may not understand the meaning. If they start using it and you understand the meaning, you can start using it. Again, I wouldn't be as frequent as they are, though. You are the helper and you're supposed to be a little professional, and professional people generally don't like start spamming acronyms a lot. Again, we're talking about mirroring language. Are they feeling sad, down, depressed, or anxious? You don't want to say, well, that's totes a bummer, kid, or stuff like that. You want to just make sure that you're keeping things kind of appropriate as far as word choice or whatnot. Gender appropriate language, obviously you all are probably familiar with this. Do not assume anybody's pronouns or gender. Ask the person what he, she, or they would like to be referred to. Pronoun checks, especially with younger people, more and more common, so it shouldn't really come out of nowhere. It's what's nice is, and we'll talk about this I think later on in the training, but if you're having a chat program, but even a text program, sometimes you might have some pre-filled questions available to you that already gives you their gender identity and stuff, and really kind of takes some of that ambiguity away, which is wonderful. When in doubt, just ask. If they do not respond or you still don't have a good idea, just kind of, I usually go back to just, very neutral they terms. That also is very appropriate. Again, as you all know, you can't assume the gender of their abuser. So you might need to ask for that as well, if only because that might change the nature of the resources you give them or what kind of skills that you're working with them. The visitor may have a negative outlook or use IDK quite a bit. This is the worst phrase in the English language. I hate it. IDK comes up all the time in online communication. They just obviously they have a very negative outlook, which makes sense. They're in crisis. They're going through an abusive situation. I would have a negative outlook too. They have a hard time expressing themselves, even with the online disinhibition effect, and even with the ability to kind of delete what they're saying and try to craft the perfect sentence. That can lead to a little bit of analysis paralysis. And they might just kind of resort to, I really don't know how I'm feeling, or I don't know how to respond to that question. IDK, IDK, IDK. It's important to always reflect what feelings are presented to you. You have to rephrase, be persistent, be creative. This is probably not new to you all, but having a list, having thesaurus.com up, or just having a list of common synonyms for feeling words available to your helpers is really good, especially early on if they're like just starting out in helpline work. It makes it easier for them to craft sentences reflecting statements like, instead of sad, I can say down, etc. And if all else fails, and I guarantee you, this will fail at some point, right? You need to be genuine with them and tell them that you're not sure what they're looking for, and you ask how you can best help them. That sentence right there, if communicated properly, generally can get you back on track. Sometimes not, but you all probably are at least pretty familiar with conversations that go awry, or just it's not the right time in this moment to have this conversation. That's kind of the perilous edge we all work with when we work with helplines. Is they can't all be perfect contacts. That's important for volunteers and staff to know, as far as their own expectations of you did your best on this one and maybe it just wasn't meant to be. But what happened is that they did contact you. You were able to at least express empathy, and they know that they might be able to call back later, or chat or text later. So some other unique features of what chat and text etiquette looks like. Again, there's going to be those long pauses between a visitor typing a response. That means you can rapidly become out of sync. This is a phenomenon in all chat and text environments. I guarantee probably most people on this call have been out of sync at least once or twice, if not way more, depending on the speed of your texting with friends and family. We have a scenario here where a text or chat visitor says, I feel so alone all the time, even when people are with me, like I'm at my birthday party. And then they go on, I felt so bad I actually tried to kill myself that night. And the advocate is like, oh, happy birthday. So first of all, a number of things there. They already said they feel alone all the time. So did they give us an emoji to work with? No. So don't break the emoji seal. But also, why would you use the happy face? But they also use an exclamation point with happy birthday because they saw this sentence, they saw the keyword birthday, and they're like, oh, that's a happy event. I should wish them a happy birthday. What happened there is, in between the visitor sending this message and the advocate drawing up this message, maybe the advocate wasn't looking at the screen properly or whatnot. The visitor sent this message right as the advocate sent this message. It happens to us personally all the time. It's not the end of the world. This is an actual scenario that happened at my old agency. We cribbed it from, we changed a little bit, but yeah, this actually happened. And it's a worst case scenario here. And even this conversation was able to get back on track. What you do is you be very genuine about it and be like, I didn't see that you sent this other message. It sounds like that night was horrible for you, and I apologize for what I did send. Why don't we talk about what happened, and what happened after that? Again, it's not the end of the world, but this is going to happen. You have to train your volunteers and staff to make sure that they can just kind of get themselves back into sync by addressing the issue and then immediately trying to move past it. A lot of the people that you chat and text with, they're not going to take that super personally, right? Because again, they've probably been out of sync with people as well, especially with text. I would say, they're probably texting a whole bunch of people at once, or again, like we said, they're multitasking, so they're used to that kind of thing, right? And if they make it an issue, then you kind of just have to follow proper protocol of like, okay, they want to talk to my supervisor or whatever. I have to engage with that. There's going to be a lot of abrupt endings on text or chat. This is super important because this is another thing that established volunteers and staff members who worked on more traditional methods of communication, this is something they don't respond very well to, right? Most likely, and I'm gonna point out that I'm coming from the general crisis field, so probably I would hazard a guess that the domestic violence field sees a lot more abrupt endings on your communications, right? That seems to be the nature of the game for you all, but it's going to be even more frequent on text and chat, not only because of the nature of the DV situation, maybe, but also because of the fact that we talked about there's technical glitches all the time. People are multitasking, so maybe that kid just has gone into class and literally cannot message with you for 50 minutes, and they were in the middle of a conversation with you. They aren't interacting with the technology in the same way you are, right? So they don't see an abrupt ending like an abrupt ending, or because of the online disinhibition effect, they're not as bothered by it because they have that screen in front of them. And so this is very different from them than if they slammed a phone on you or just hung up in the middle of a conversation, right? They don't have a tone of voice to work with, so they have a very different connection with you. It's not to say they're not connected at all, it's just a different way of interacting with it. So it's good to go over with your staff and volunteers all the different reasons. Again, with the DV situations that you deal with, you can cover that stuff pretty easily, but then you might want to cover kind of the various internet issues and like other tech glitches that might come up, and just kind of briefly run down them with people. You also need to process not knowing why someone ended a chat. Again, you might be pretty comfortable with that already, but it's good to know that, especially with online emotional support systems, you might not need to do a little bit more of that aftercare with your volunteers and staff. Or if you're a volunteer and staff yourself, you might need to go to your supervisor more often because you find the abrupt endings a little bit emotionally triggering. And then finally, you all are super smart human beings. I trust in you all. I have faith in you all. Please don't click on any links sent to you by a text or chat visitor. Never do it. Never. You could have had a 2-hour conversation where you both had spiritual breakthroughs and like would like to name your kids after each other. Just do not do it. The meme is not worth it. The link to their, portfolio on Etsy isn't worth it. Like none of it's worth it. It's almost always going to be boundary blurring at the very best, and at the very worst, it is a phishing or scam attempt or something like that, and it's terrible for your technology safety protocols. So don't do it. When in doubt, the administrators here are not going to like this, but just throw your agency under the bus and say, I literally can't do that. I'm not allowed to. Sorry. And just work past it there. Instead, talk around it. What did you want me to get from that website that you linked? Is there something I can search for in Google? If they're trying to if they're trying to talk to you about another agency or whatever, it's like, oh, I can look that up on my end and then kind of walk you through it or something like that. See, I see there's a question from.
So, Bo, we have a couple of things. An anonymous attendee posted a comment in the question and answer section, and we also have someone who raised their hand.
So when there are long pauses on DV chats, I'm wondering if that could be because the abuser is present. It may not be safe for the survivor to chat at the moment or to receive chats. Yeah, that's obviously a concern. That's one of the things actually when I'm doing this with non-domestic violence agencies, that's something that we say is a concern is like, that you need to address that with your staff and volunteers that this could be why is because they're in a DV situation. Even if they haven't disclosed that to you, that might not be the reason they're chatting in right now. But that could be a reason why they just kind of jump off the communication. Maria mentions in the beginning of the call, my suggestion is to always ask the question, is it safe to talk? That's a very good suggestion. Depending on how your program is structured, that might be something that's automatically done, or you could do some kind of safety assessment, safety/risk assessment if we're talking about suicide, safety assessment for DV before they even get into the chat, which might be helpful for you all, but also might kind of come across as a little cold and you'd rather just do it in-house through your personal communication. But yeah, so good comment and questions. And yeah, again, feel free to just throw those out there. Okay. Oh, there's another one. Is there a concern that another person could take over their phone without the advocate being aware? This could be an abuser or anyone else. Yeah, Danielle, not to scare you all, but that's absolutely something that could happen. And it's, I would say a seasoned chatter volunteer would be pretty good about seeing the difference in how the messages come across, like the client's etiquette, so to speak, and like the way they phrase sentences. I will say this is a bit controversial, but when you look at helpline work, right, and you look at the length of context that we're talking about with these online emotional support services, and then you look at like state regulations of like staff members need to have like 15-minute breaks every so often or whatever, and they absolutely should have those breaks. It's for their own sanity and health and well-being as well. Some agencies will do warm handoffs, very brief warm handoffs between like an advocate and a supervisor, and the supervisor will handle the conversation without the client knowing. Again, that's controversial because I'm sure a lot of you heard that and were just like, oh, that's terrible. But you know, what's also terrible is like turnover and not being able to take your breaks and like having to wait for 2.5 hours because that's how long the conversation's going on chat. So it's kind of just it's what you weigh as a program and as an agency for what's best for the clients and what's also best for yourselves. But with that example, right, even the agencies themselves have to be super careful about following kind of a relatively model framework for how you're composing your messages out to the clients, because they will start noticing like you haven't capitalized your sentences for like 5 minutes. What's going on, right? They'll jump on that because they're going to notice it too, just like you might notice on the opposite end. But to go back to your initial concern, it is a concern and one you have very little control over. I would just recommend that, you know, all the advocates in question really monitor not only what is being said in the chat, but how it's being said. Syntax, word use, capitalization, and punctuation. It's not 100%. There's going to be some false positives where, you know, if somebody starts rapid firing some sentences, maybe they don't punctuate every single one. And maybe you can like go back and be like, oh, we had a kind of a breakthrough with one of my empathy statements where they didn't realize that they were feeling this way on top of this way. So now they're excited and they're sending a lot of messages that might account for that. But it's really just going to be it's one of those fun quote unquote aspects of online emotional support systems that you just kind of have to deal with. So you always have to be on guard. For you administrators and supervisors, I'm gonna expound. There's not actually that many slides with this section, but I'm gonna expound as much as possible because there's a lot to weigh when we talk about what software and platforms you're going to be using. Because Denise or whoever else, can correct me if I'm wrong, it's going to be up to each agency in Pennsylvania what they use. Do I have that right?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. And it's a weird, wide world out there for online emotional, online systems of communication, and there's a lot of stuff to go through. So we're going to hit this as hard as possible. I will say that I am only one subject matter expert, and I barely am an expert on this. So when in doubt, if you have a good board composition, hopefully you have someone on your board who might be a tech expert. You might have your own internal tech people that you can talk to. You might talk to similar agencies in your area who have used maybe a local provider, or you can go on and get recommendations online as well. You could also even talk to, you know, your state funders, other people like that. The more information you can gather, the better, because most likely when you pick a platform like this, you're going to be married to it for a number of years, and you want to make sure you have something that fits well for you. Most platforms, worth their salt, also let your advocates see when the visitor is typing. So we have an example here for both chat and texting, which is very nice. Your advocates are going to see the software program and they're going to see a transcript of responses. This is super important and super nice for texting. There's never going to be a point, hopefully, where your folk are texting into their smartphones to a client. It's all going to be done through some kind of web software. So we see this kind of quickie example here where we just see the transcript. This is one of the greatest things about online emotional support systems. And honestly, one of the reasons that you can really actually make two chats or texts at once go is you have the entire transcript in front of you. So you're not frantically taking notes on a call or anything like that. You can just scroll up and be like, oh wait, didn't they mention their brother? They did mention their brother. Okay, so now I can kind of craft my statement to remember that, you know, their brother at one point was a support for them, and see what that's looking like now. And then you can see that they're typing, which should be your indicator to try to stay in sync and generally let them kind of finish out their sentence. I will say with the software platform I'm most familiar with, and I've heard of this happening with other people, This thing here is can be rough. It's very much dependent on the quality of the internet service providers who are talking to each other. So there might be a false positive where it says the visitor is typing and it's been like 2 or 3 minutes, and you're like, are you writing a manifesto? What's going on? And it's literally because it's a false positive and they haven't actually been typing. So use your best guess based on how the flow of the conversation has gone before. There absolutely will be clients that contact you who do write like long paragraphs or whatnot. I've also just personally, as a side note, I've had many contacts, more with chat than text, where I will start a conversation with someone and I feel they've already copied and pasted from a Word document their entire life story and they just put it into the chat. I would recommend being strong with your barriers there, because you shouldn't have to read a novel to get to the point where you can help the person in their moment. Your services, a lot like general crisis services, are most likely going to be very immediate, and your sweet spot is the kind of the immediate framework. What's happened in the past 48 hours? What's happened today that's led you to contact us, and how can we help you with a very short-term safety plan? And so a biopic or a biography of somebody's life isn't going to be super useful for you. You could talk around and be like, I really appreciate that backstory. I was wondering if we could focus on what's going on now. So which platform should you use? Should you do both chat and text, the pros and cons of each? So this is where I get to just talk out loud, which is great. So first off, I would recommend, we are not, International Council of Helplines does not at all like endorse or negate any single platform service, right? You're going to find what's best for you. You're all also going to have very individual price points. I don't go into price that much, but that's probably going to be one of your primary, indicators, right? Pie in the sky, maybe you have funding coming down where like literally you do get to just write your budget. I would also say from personal experience, this is very personal experience. This is one of those line items when developing a budget for a new program where you don't get as much kind of a, people don't like raise their eye at the difference between a $1,500 and $3,000 software platform as they do with like your other administrative expenses. Like, why did you put 20 hours of a full-time person on this when it doesn't look like they're going to be doing 20 hours of work for this project? So that being said, I am most familiar with it. I'm going to put this in the thing here. Most familiar with a service called iCarol. Some of you all might use it, if not a majority of you. It's a software platform that does pretty much everything you want it to do as a service provider. It does shift scheduling, does data management, call reporting, and it also has a very, very developed, wonderful chat and text program build for it. There is a online kind of called the Amazon of software called Capterra. It's like Amazon, but for just specifically for software platforms. You can go there and you can search around for something that might meet your needs as well. Should have price points on there. If not, you have to reach out to the individual software agencies and just check with them. What you're going to do is you're going to find your price point, right? You're going to find what you think is best for you. Other things that you need to consider is stuff like, are you going to use a license-based model? Because licensing, as you might be aware with your phone systems or whatnot, gets super expensive. So you might want to try to find a system that doesn't use licenses, but instead is just all inclusive and you just get to create as many users as you want. The functional difference there is that sometimes those non-license based programs are a little bit limited in how they can interact with other platforms that you already have, or they might be a little more expensive. I mentioned iCarol. iCarol's usually on the higher end of expense, so that's something that you want to consider. Also, ease of use. Don't just think about the clients. The clients are probably going to see relatively similar chat windows. If you've ever used online customer support, you're not redoing the wheel here, right? It's going to be a chat window that they chat into, and they're basically done. Texting is even more. I mean, they just literally use their text app on their phone, so you don't have to worry about that nearly as much. But what you really want to account for when figuring out these systems and which one works best for you is all layers of your users and whether form meets function in the right way for them. So obviously your first concern is going to be with your advocates, right? Is this easy to use for counseling? Is it easy to use as far as getting the right referrals to people? Like maybe you could have them test pilot it. How do they feel about it? Does it feel good to them? Does it feel natural? The more natural it feels to them, the less pain point you'll have on your end when you're training people, especially new people. But then kind of scale that up. So you're going to start with advocates, but then what's the supervision piece of the software looks like? Can you do stuff like live monitoring of chats and texts, which is super important for quality assurance, right? And also if someone absolutely just needs like in immediate help with a high risk situation, rather than doing a screen share or something like that, there might be a built-in mechanism on this platform where you can literally slide into the conversation as a supervisor unbeknownst to the client and kind of monitor how things are going. That's a very important piece. And then as far as an administrative aspect, how easy is it to manage your user lists? How easy is it to, say, go through the process of adding a user, deleting a user? What kind of statistics do you get access to? How easy is it to change your form, right? Do you have to put in a work order from the software end, or do they give you the tools to kind of reword questions based on maybe you got a new funder who needs, a few more questions answered or whatnot? So all of these are considerations. You want to make sure that the platform works at all layers of your organization. What about text? Do you want to do chat? Do you want to do text? I would recommend you do both. I always recommend both. Again, there's a bedrock of demand there, right? If you had to choose one, if you had to be like, I want to project into the future how people are going to interact with these online services, I would choose text. I would go all in on text. Chat is wonderful. Chat will probably never functionally go away, but even on like newer generation phones, right? You can don't actually use Zoom to raise your hand, but raise your hand personally if you've maybe stopped texting because you've started using Facebook Messenger, because that doesn't cost you anything, or you just have access to Wi-Fi, and so you're good to go. Text and chat are kind of meeting in the middle in very captivating ways as far as like the technology goes on smartphones or whatnot. But most likely text is going to outlast chat. There's always going to be some kind of messaging app on all sorts of phones that are linked to the network of carriers that we have in the United States and abroad. So if you had to pick one, I would pick text. If you have another important consideration here is that what is your bandwidth as an agency, right? Because if you start chat and text at both, what we've generally seen just with the way algorithms work with advertising new services, chat taps into its demand a lot quicker than text. Text is starting to catch up to chat that way, but you're going to have a lot more chatters than you are going to have texters from the get-go. There's some important points of consideration there. If your text number is going to be the same as your current like crisis line number or something like that, then maybe you will already have kind of people who want to start texting you. But this is all to say that you're going to have a ton of people from the get-go. And so you just want to make sure maybe you just start off with text because you want that to be kind of a lower occurrence rate, and also because therefore that lets you scale appropriately as you start kind of really building the system. It's a little easier to do a pilot with text as well. That's going to be really agency dependent. I couldn't really tell you what's going to be best for you all personally, agency to agency. But again, text is going to be the pony that wins the race, so to speak. Depending on how things go, though, it's really hard to accurately measure like just how technology will advance as we kind of keep going forward. So maybe there will be chat-like systems that pop up again with increased demand based on just some innovation that comes by. There's a lot of pros and cons to both chat and text. Text, obviously, with your emergency procedures, you're used to working with phone numbers or whatnot, so that's really great. I already kind of alluded to the difficulties that chat has with that. Text is also a little more omnipresent. When we talked about youth using chat and text systems more often, that's generally the case, but that tapers off if we just look at text. There's plenty of people above the age of 30, myself included, who text way more often than they call nowadays, right? So you're going to hit a greater demographic of people if you start a text program than maybe you would if you start a chat program. Another pro of text, and I've alluded to this again, but I'll just say it out loud again, text is much easier technologically as far as like troubleshooting and just working with. You don't have to account for very individual browsers, right? There's iPhone Safari, but there's iPhone Chrome versus Android Chrome versus Android Firefox versus desktop Firefox and all that fun stuff. There's a lot of different variables with chat that you just really don't have with text. With text, it's literally one phone carrier talks to another. So there's going to be some differences there depending on your software platform that you choose. They might have a different way of sending out automated messages. Carrier to carrier interactions affect everything from does the thing that I send split up into 4 different messages, and are they out of order? Because they're always out of order, because text is designed to aggravate you sometimes. That's a carrier to carrier issue, right? There's going to be some software platforms that resolve that and make it so it's just one nice long message that's not broken up. So that's something that you want to talk about as well. But generally, that's not nearly as painful as some of the stuff that pops up with chat, where you're trying to account for why couldn't this chatter talk to us? It's because the button to click submit information for their pre-chat survey was hidden by a pop-up that we didn't account for, and all that fun stuff. So it's really going to be what you feel your bandwidth is, and also where you want to position yourself for the future. There's a lot of pros to chat as well. They're just kind of I would say they're outweighed by the pros of the text right now. But again, if you can afford to do both, and that's within your realm, I would absolutely do both, because there are people who chat but do not text. Chat is, for domestic violence, a little easier to hide than text. I already talked about, abusers can get access to phone records, if they're controlling the finances, and we know that that's very, very regularly occurring. If they're controlling the finances, they get the billing for, your phone carrier, which means they can see, if not the actual text messages, they can see the amount of text sent at any one time. And then they can go back to the person that contacted you and say, why were you sending so many texts this month? And they'll probably put together, it's because I was very abusive, so I bet you were contacting someone that I didn't want you to contact. That being said, even with that as a concern, there's going to be a whole bunch of people that reach out to you by text. It's just the nature of the game. It's the easiest technology that they have access to currently. So any questions, concerns about that? I just kind of ranted there. I wish I could just give you, this is what you should do, right? But it's just such a wide world. And again, with everybody's different price points and whatnot, you're going to have to do a lot of groundwork just to find the right solution for you. So there's some other platform considerations that you want to make sure when you start looking at these services, these platforms, just to ensure that they're doing their due diligence, especially if they're going to start sending some customer support representatives at you. You can have these handy, so when you start those conversations, there's obviously, number one for you all, safety and privacy considerations. So when the conversation is ended by the advocate, the chat window on the survivor's device is automatically closed. We need to make sure that conversation history is either erased or stored somewhere where even the client can't get it again, because as we just talked about, what is the client's technology might also be the abuser's technology. They might be able to get access to their phone, computer, or whatnot, and try to look into logs or whatnot. You want to ensure data privacy. So when you go through Capterra, or when you start looking at other software providers, a good thing to keep in mind is that most of these platforms are for customer service communication, not victim services, right? You throw HIPAA out there and they think it's like, an animal in Africa. They don't, maybe they don't know of it, or they haven't done the due diligence enough to know that, like, hey, this is something that, we need to make sure we're compliant with. So you need to make sure the platform can set up to collect the data that complies with your privacy and safety policies, does not violate your confidentiality best practices. That's absolutely key. This is kind of where you want to start your conversation, right? If they can't meet this, you need to move on to another platform, because it's just a no-go right from the get-go. Hopefully you can find one that turns off the ability to save and or record conversations. If their data privacy is very secure, then it's great on your end for quality assurance and behind the scenes supervision to have access to these conversations. What happens though is that also, if there's any kind of legal compliance that you have to follow, you just have to jump through a hoop of making sure you can provide those conversations to law enforcement if necessary, in a safely encodable and transmissible manner. That's probably not something that's anything new to you all. If the platform has the ability to see personally identifying information, again, we're going to talk maybe a little bit about HIPAA there, or just your own internal policies, or any kind of content from survivors. you need to have, if you have an attorney, either on your board or just on retainer or whatnot, you need to advocate for strong language in the contract that imposes strict consequences should the company access this information. Most of the time, if you're getting a platform that has had a long history of working with victim services programs and not just customer service communication, they will already have these hoops jump through, and they will have like legal compliance and privacy agreements that they'll have ready and signed and that you can sign off on. But if a breach occurs on their end, if their servers get hacked or anything like that, or if they misrepresented exactly how much their encryption, how good their encryption methods are, you need to have strong legal language to make sure that you are not at fault if that does occur. And it does occur. The encryption standards online kind of vary. What weirdly enough, some of the best encryption that's out there is Google to Google communications, which isn't really any email sent from a Google email to another Google email is automatically encrypted within Google, which is really great. But Google has more money than anyone else, so they can afford to do stuff like that, right? A lot of these other individual agencies, whatnot, they do not have that kind of thing. There are industry standards, and so you just need to ask them what industry standards do you operate for your encryption methods and your data transmission methods. They'll give you that. Best thing to do then is go to your local, go through your HIPAA training, your HIPAA stuff, and just make sure that it complies with that. And that should be pretty clearly laid out in most HIPAA manuals somewhere. You want to consider using a chat platform or text platform that allows for three-way conversations. That's a best practice for translation services. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of communities that have domestic violence that do not have English as their first language. So this is another thing that you can start the conversation off with these software platforms, is how easy is it to plug in an interpreter into these conversations if need be. And then obviously when you are going to start doing that, you want to make sure you follow proper consent and disclosure guidelines when including third-party interpreters. Sometimes that's automatically handled by the chat or text program itself, and it'll let them know. Sometimes you just have to train your volunteers and your other advocates that the proper way of telling people that that's what you're going to be doing. Okay, so I've reached the text or chat process. I really want to go back here and see if there's any individual questions from any of the agencies here about trying to find the right software for you. I can't give you like an easy answer, but if you have any considerations that I haven't covered here, now is the time to maybe ask those, or any thoughts that have come to your mind. Would be interested to hear too who has already started this process and what your barriers or what you've learned has been. Okay, so Debbie says we're trying out live chat. They offer a nonprofit service with 20 free licenses. They do also offer a HIPAA compliance fee, but that may cost an added fee. I'm waiting to find out from them yet. So I don't know live chat specifically. I would say, not knowing them, Debbie, I would check to see what the value add is of that HIPAA compliancy. Is it going, so some questions to ask them is, does that change the nature of the encryption of the chat or text contacts, right? And if so, internally, you should ask yourself, why don't they just encrypt at the highest level of encryption anyway? Because usually an encryption is a back-end thing that they do on their servers that, is usually software-wide. Now, it might literally be an extra cost for them, and that's why they have to have you shell out some more money for that. But I'd just be a little wary of that, I guess. But I mean, they might be wonderful people. And 20 free licenses is pretty sweet if you're moving to a license-based system. I saw one pop up in Q&A, so I'll get to Zoe first, and then we'll address that one. How does a solo text or chat program price compare to one that includes both, or do you have to buy two different pieces of software? That is an excellent question. It really depends on the software. So for instance, the one that I mentioned, iCarol, natively does both. And you know what? I'm really glad you asked that question, because that's actually one of the points that I wanted to make. When you start pricing this out, right, there's going to be the base price of the platform, but then if you have the ability to try to at least guesstimate exactly how much of a pain point this is going to be on your supervisors and administrators, or even and especially for your advocates, actually, on, do you have to manage two platforms at once? Because I've started using the phrase platform creep in that, and I went through this with my old center, right? So maybe not a complete one-for-one correlation to what you all have, but we had multiple different funders, and a lot of them had different online programs, right? But we were picking up contracts either midway through, or a new contract that had been with one provider and then switched to us. And so these platforms were already set in stone, and they didn't want to change to our iCarol system. So at one point, we had certain volunteers and staff have to manage like 3 different software platforms at once, right? We had one called Mozio, we had one called iCarol, and we had what was the other one? Oh, it was another instance of iCarol, and that was its own special hell to deal with. So you can't guarantee, especially in the time of COVID, if people are working remotely, it's really hard to guarantee everyone has multiple monitors. And even if they do, just think back, the amount of clicking that any one advocate has to do, you want to minimize clicking, right? You want people engaged in the conversation they're in. Having to click back and forth and manage 2 different contacts and 2 different platforms is mentally taxing, right? It's a multitask that our brain doesn't like. We can get into kind of a muscle memory flow of it, but it still leads to kind of an idea of burnout and unhappiness on the part of your advocates. So I would highly recommend trying to find a platform that does both. They might be more expensive, but I bet if you price out exactly how much more time you're going to have to spend training these advocates on both platforms rather than just one, and how much of your administrative time is spent switching between the 2 platforms to do stuff like gathering statistics or whatnot, it probably comes out in the wash. Or at the very least, it's not enough of a difference for you to put yourself through that kind of that pain. I'm going to get to there was a Q&A first, so we'll get that. How to address consent issues with a chat text caller. Lizette, I'm going to need a little more clarification on that, so I'm going to table that. I'm going to get to this other question, which I think is a little more straightforward, and then we'll kind of dive into that. So our program has started using Resource Connect. Any thoughts on that system? Unfortunately, Ashley, I do not know much about Resource Connect. I would recommend going to Capterra, that place that I mentioned earlier, and search for it there, and you can see a lot of customer reviews of it and everything. Also, Ashley, so it says Resource Connect, but I assume they also have like chat and text capabilities as well? Okay, well, you can let me know in chat. So Lizette, I don't know if you can get on voice or if you want to chat in the chat box what you mean by consent issues with the chat or text caller. Are you saying that they're consenting to being texted at, or that's what they do, web and chat services? Okay, cool, Ashley.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about. Since we're sharing specific information between each other, and there could be some liability considerations, not to mention safety considerations. Through the traditional phone, it's phone to phone. We do talk about confidentiality with them through that.
Sure.
So like, is that different with chat and text versus phone? Because they're
Yeah.
different platforms, and there's, one's being affirmative with what they're communicating.
Right. So the short answer is yes, and it's dependent on which platform you're using. For text, it's kind of interesting. So since they're texting through their phone carrier,
Mm-hmm.
they are already like they have an agreement with their phone carrier, right? So that because they had to sign on to a contract or something like that.
Right.
So that handles that end of things, right? Your phone carrier has a legal obligation not to release certain information. As far as on your end, when you're like maybe saving these conversations or whatnot, that is generally implied, but you can structure your immediate message, because there's an immediate message that's sent whenever you're texting someone other than like person to person, right? And it's
Okay.
that, and we've all seen it. It's like, do you consent to, thank you for reaching out to blank, do you consent to having more text sent, yes or no? And then they usually give in all caps yes or whatnot.
Okay.
You can tailor that to be like, do you consent to have like to having more text sent, and also be aware that this conversation might be monitored for quality assurance purposes or stuff like that. I know that generally doesn't go over as well on the DV end of things than just general crisis. So you might want to find like kind of the best language that reassures people that you're going to keep confidentiality as much as possible, but that you are using a system that monitors chat transcripts and stuff like that.
Okay.
Now, that being said, I think I alluded to on one of the slides, depending on what your agency's policies and procedures are, you could just like get rid of the transcripts as soon as you're done. That's really hard to do when it comes, that's a hard sell when you want to do like back end quality assurance and supervision, or if there's any kind of legal compliance you have to follow. But that is a thing that you can talk to the software provider about and just be like, can we just quote unquote shred as soon as we're done with any contact? It doesn't help the client because it's still going to be saved on their phone and they'll have to manually delete. But I would wager that that's something that you maybe talk about with the people experiencing domestic violence issues when they text with you. And then with chat, it's a little different because there's going to be probably a service agreement provided by the software platform running the connection. And it's something that they either click on that they agree, or that they at least, it's like shown boldly, like here's the service agreement. As soon as you start chatting with this provider, you are entering into the service agreement with us. And then it's, it's what you generally look at when you download a new software, and like, it's that 5-page, you're selling your soul to the devil kind of thing, and you're just like, okay, click, so you can talk to your software provider about what that language actually says. And I would absolutely make sure you have like any kind of legal help or aid available to your center to kind of look it over, just to make sure it's dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's that you want. One of my pain points as a trainer here is just, there's just so many of these software platforms. I mean, it's obviously not a surprise that everyone under the sun is trying to monetize internet communication, right? And again, a lot of these agencies have come from the customer support realm, like a lot of them, right? And they just now are sniffing out the fact that states are kind of catching up to the fact that like, hey, our providers need to be able to talk to people online. And so they will absolutely make really big pitches to you to be like, hey, our software is the best. People just click on this link and they get in touch with your, representatives or whatever you're calling these people, and blah, blah, blah. And that's where you really need to be informed. I'm going to go back to, you really need to like just get these considerations down so that whoever at your agency is deciding on what platform to use, they know the right questions to ask. You just need to ask about encryption. If HIPAA's if the agency doesn't know what HIPAA is, probably move on, right? But you absolutely need to just kind of run down from the get-go. This is our, what we would call minimum viable product. This is absolutely like the baseline of stuff that you need to do for us. That is going to vary agency from agency, but most of you, I mean, all of you will want really good encryption, right? Just in case there are data breaches. That's how you kind of guard against data breaches, even if people are able to gather that data from the cloud or whatnot. If it's completely encrypted, there's generally no way to actually get good info from it without, hackers have their own kind of value cost, right? If they're trying to literally hack for personal information for identity theft or whatnot, if it's, I'm trying to remember, I think it's 128 encryption, might be 64, but anything on top of that, and usually it takes them weeks or months to de-encrypt one specific file, and that they're just not going to do that. So they're looking for easy stuff. Safety and privacy considerations, translation services. But again, also some of your minimum viable product conversation will be stuff like, how easy is it to supervise others? How easy is it to add users? What kind of data management, what kind of statistical analysis can I get from this, right? My bailiwick was iCarol. I loved iCarol very much. It does a lot of things very well. One thing that I didn't really enjoy about it, though, is I didn't really like its statistics page. I think they've done some work on it. It might be better, but what they did allow for me to do is I could download all of my data into one Excel document, and then I could just pivot table away and just do all of my numbers crunching that way, which was a lot easier for me. But some people love iCarol's, statistical page. So it's just kind of based on your own personal preference. So I'll just leave it at this, is that this is a big wide world, and when in doubt, don't jump into anything with, eyes wide shut, right? Just make sure that you're doing your level best. I do want to circle back. That was a wonderful question. When in doubt, try to find a platform that can do more. You want to position yourself for growth, and generally it shouldn't be that much more of a price point, right? So say you're going to start with chat, but you do want to do text within, a couple of years. You don't want to have to do this shopping process again if you pick a software that doesn't do everything you want from the get-go. You want to be able to grow into your software rather than the other way around. Otherwise, again, you fall into the realm of platform creep or just stacking systems upon systems. And this isn't just for online emotional support. I mean, this is a consideration for any thriving agency, right? You can raise your hand. How many of you all have a KISS flow system and a Salesforce system and a back-end accounting, QuickBooks and blah, blah, blah. You have all of these systems stacked on top of each other. Some of those you can't get away from. It's just the nature of the game. But if you could go back in time and there was one software that did all of that for you in one package, even if it cost like triple, right? It might be worth looking at because it's going to save you staff time down the road. Oh, Jen has a question. I'm going to read it out loud, Jen. Sorry. When our agency began launching a text chat program, we found it was helpful to use the National Network to End Domestic Violence's digital safety toolkit that is found on their website. Talks about assessing agency readiness for providing digital services, choosing technology, and best practices for providing text and chat services. Yeah, that's awesome. I did some searches. I didn't actually find that. That's really cool, though. A lot of these national networks are, like Lifeline, for instance, International Council for Helplines. We're trying to do a better job nationally of like providing good tools for individual and like state level agencies as people kind of grow into these realms. So that's really cool to hear. Ashley wants to talk about Resource Connect more. It's not all about you, Ashley. That's fine though. Resource Connect is end-to-end encrypted. Exactly. That's what you want. Chat and text is one user-friendly portal. I think you probably meant, and it's super affordable. Well, there you go. All right. Karen, that's a really good question. I'm wondering if maybe Denise or someone else, you could start gathering that information on your end and then kind of sending that out along with other documentation, just what people are investigating and choosing from. I mean, I've thrown out iCarol. I've thrown out a lot of names, right? So that's a good start, is to just look at what your peers are doing and seeing if that works best for you. A lot of software platforms will have an API, which for those of you who don't know is just a way for software platforms to communicate with other software platforms or other platforms in general. So a lot of software platforms will have an API that they can communicate with your phone system. Some of you all may already have this going, but like as soon as a call comes in, a phone record will come up immediately, and the counselor can start filling out the form then. That's really nice. Okay, well, I'm wondering, so we have about 25 minutes left. If people are comfortable with that, we can move into a little bit of the next topic, which is what the chat and text process looks like, and then we can kind of end early on that. Not early, excuse me, we can end midway through that. Otherwise, I'm happy to continue to take questions as you kind of keep compiling your notes on your end. Again, if you have, the software questions are obviously very nuanced and there's a lot going on. So go ahead, if you have any other questions, throw them into the chat or throw them to Denise maybe after the fact, and then we can address them either next week at next week's training, or I'll just kind of comprise an email that can be sent out. So let's talk a little bit about what the text or chat process actually looks like. So I'm not going to go as in depth into these because you all are established agencies and you know how to help people in crisis, right? I'll do my best to draw this back to the difference between phones and chat, or in-person contact and chat and text. But there's, the same elements that you're using when teaching people how to engage with people in crisis on your traditional services. Most of those are going to translate one for one to how to chat and text with people. That being said, a lot of people find this as a good refresher, and I like to go through it. So we'll just go through. So these are the elements of what I would say is a good chat or text contact. Obviously, all of these could be split into like 50 different levels each. So this is a very large like landscape analysis of, kind of just the overall idea of what a perfect contact looks like. And we all know there is no such thing, but this is what we strive for. So we strive for establishing good contact. We like to do an assessment of risk or safety. And then if we designate someone at imminent risk for harm, either to self or others, we assist those people as best as our agency allows. We engage in what we call collaborative problem solving, which you and the DV community are very obviously in tune with your safety planning for people, to try to help them either out of the abusive situation or help them try to figure out their next path forward into getting the help that they need. And then finally, we will spend a good amount of time on closing the conversation, because closing the conversation in chat and text looks a lot different than what it does in phones and face-to-face communication sometimes. Some general tips and guidelines. Again, some of these you'll probably be familiar with when you train people on phones or in-person communication, but it's good to go over these for chat and text because you can find yourself when interacting with a new medium. And all of you have been chatting and texting for a while now, right? I doubt any of you are Luddites who don't have a phone or computer or whatnot. You're at least familiar with the communication. But when you put on a different hat, right? So you're not, your own personal self. You're the helper, right? You're going into work. You're going into volunteer. Your response to technology might be very different. So this first point here, trying to keep your responses fairly short, that is super important because it's very easy to fall into the trap of typing up manifestos, right? You don't hear yourself speaking and they're just words on the screen to you, right? So it might not seem like you're drowning out your client when you send 3 to 4 sentences each time you respond. But just like in a phone conversation, you absolutely are kind of sucking all the air out of the room. Every good contact, for the most part, is driven by the client, and they should be doing more talking than you. That's the whole point of kind of an active listening system, right? Is that you're actively listening, you're not actively talking. You'll have to interject somewhere and you'll have to reflect feelings and ask some questions, but for the most part, they're leading and you're following. So try to keep responses fairly short. We don't put a number on this just because, again, it's going to matter contact to contact, agency to agency. But generally, I wouldn't type more than 2 sentences, maybe 3 occasionally. If you're doing a summary statement or something like that, maybe 3 sentences is appropriate, maybe even 4. But you want to keep something to 1 or 2 sentences. You want each thing that you type and throw out there to have an impact, right? The more that you're throwing jabs, you're not throwing hooks or uppercuts. Everything should have a purpose. The more sentences that you're typing, the less that your purpose is clear. That's how I usually frame it for myself because, as you can probably tell, I'm a very verbose person. So I keep talking and talking and talking, and I need to make sure that I do more listening, listening, and listening as I talk to people in crisis. You want to keep track of when the visitor is typing. We covered that when we covered software platforms. I honestly, so that sounds like such a minor thing, y'all, but it's one of those things that goes beyond quality of life for your advocates and really almost needs to be integrated into the software, and it should be a no-go if they can't give you that. Because you don't have a frame of reference often with chat and text clients. So by God, at the very least, if you can at least understand when they're starting to type something, then that gives you at least something to work with. It gives your advocates something to work with, right? It gives you the ability to stay in sync as much as possible. That being said, this is much harder to do with text than it is with chat. It's kind of carrier dependent. So you'll just talk to your software platform and be like, is there any way we can get to this functionality with text? Because we absolutely would love to have it. If not, some of your training for your advocates might have around text might have to be like you need to give an appropriate amount of time for someone to respond. You might even just limit to you don't respond until they put something in, or you wait a requisite amount of time and then kind of do a little nudge being like, hey, are you doing okay? Are you still there? Has something come up? You always want to convey professionalism while being approachable and friendly. That's easy for us to say in this training. It's hard in practice. Your advocates are going to find their own voice online, just like they did when they started doing face-to-face or over the phone contacts, right? It takes a while to find that kind of perfect level of genuineness. But when we talk about professionalism, I always like to say you want to be a little more human than a customer service representative, but a little less human than like one of their friends on Facebook or something like that, right? It's a fine line to tread, but they'll find it eventually. You want to establish good rapport, just like on the phones. You're going to use that with skills-based systems, some kind of model that you train on. You want to problem solve, but don't give advice. Again, this, right? Like you don't like giving direct advice generally, not even in DV situations where they're asking for it, like, please tell me exactly what to do. You always want to shoot for collaborative problem solving. But again, just like this one here, the online disinhibition effect goes both ways, right? It's going to work for your clients to immediately give you a bunch of info and maybe some very, very personal information, but you're going to be disinhibited to kind of going against some of the best practices that you've already developed for yourself on those traditional mediums. So you're going to be like, oh, there's nothing wrong with me telling this person, oh yeah, why don't you get outside, get some fresh air and see how that makes you feel, because you're interacting with the technology in a much different way. So just remember, we're not giving advice. Advice looks a lot different typed than it does vocalizing it out loud. That's just kind of how it is. And so it's something to be mindful of as you integrate these services. And again, we want to focus on the crisis issue in the present moment. For the most part, with any of these helpline services, as you well know, you can't do anything about 6 months in the past. It might be one of the drivers to what their current crisis moment is, but it certainly is not anything within the realm of possibility that you can enact upon. And also, you can't live 6 months to a year down the road, right? Your comfort zone is the present, which we define as usually 24 to 48 hours past and 24 to 48 hours future. That means sometimes you have to do a little bit of redirection. Again, you all have been in this game for quite a while, so I'm sure you're familiar with callers who will kind of circle around a subject often and kind of ruminate on things quite a bit. That's nothing new, but it does mean it's a little bit different when you interact with that online and people start, again, putting paragraph after paragraph after paragraph of backstory, and you'll just have to address with your advocates the best way that you feel is to get to kind of the point. What is the critical issue? What brought you in chat or text today? We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So how do you establish good contact? Again, you're not reinventing the wheel here. You're going to use some of the same strategies as you would with phone calls. Always going to express empathy and do some of that reflecting talk. Paraphrasing, I want to address that a little bit. Just because you and the person have access to the entire transcript of your conversation, that doesn't take away from paraphrasing's power of just being able to take everything that that person told you and summarize it in kind of a concise 3 to 4 sentence summary, right? It's still impactful for the people. I tell you what it also does is it humanizes the conversation a little bit, because that's something we usually do in face to face or over the phone conversations, right? It lets them know that you're not a robot, right? And I think we talk about that later on, but there will be people who accuse you of being a robot, because especially young people are so used to that kind of, interaction online. Anything that you can do to kind of develop a genuine and warm tone, paraphrasing actually does that, because not a lot of bots actually paraphrase. They don't see any reason for that. That's not how they're coded. You want to use patience and matching the visitor's language and pace. Pace is super important online, just like it is off. And like we keep pushing, the pace is going to be slower, right? And you need to make sure you're matching that pace. Maybe they don't like the fact that as soon as they're done typing out, a few paragraphs of what's been going on today or whatnot, you immediately reply, or you rapid fire some clarity questions, right? They want you to be with them in the moment, and the way that you can best show that is by kind of adopting their pace, not rushing. Similar to that, your interaction with the software is going to be very, very different than if you have a phone call or an in-person contact. But another thing about not rushing, we're going to talk a little bit more about this when we talk about concluding the call. But if you're used to a 20-minute phone call and then you start taking hour-long chats, right? You're a human being. And even if you're an extrovert, and since you're in a helping profession, chances are you're not, your brain is going to be like, God, we've been talking to this person forever. Aren't we done? Can we be done? You know what will get them done? Let's get to planning. Let's be done with this emotional talk and let's figure out something to do. That's where your brain's going to go. You need to make sure you're mindful of that and not rush to any one part of the conversation. Now, obviously, this is going to be dependent on kind of the needs of your agency, and they might give you specific ideas of, okay, it's been an hour and you're working during peak time, so we really need to start seeing if we can get you over to another client so that we can kind of keep our queue low, right? So it's just going to be weighing how the individual interaction's going. Displaying authenticity and genuineness, again, that's really easy for us as trainers to say. It's really hard to put in practice. We're going to talk a little bit more about that and try to give you as much of a framework for it as possible. I have some transcript examples. I'm not a great actor, so I'm not going to read those out loud, but you can read through them on your own time once you get access to this. Use them in your own training if you want. These are cribbed from either cribbed from actual conversations and then we've changed enough so that it's not identifiable, or based on actual conversations that we have seen. So again, we're going to do a lot of paraphrasing, reflection, matching the visitor's language and pace. There's so much reflection. You wouldn't think that there'd be as much reflection in online emotional support as there would be in phones and stuff, but there's just as much, if not more. And when we say using a warm and genuine tone, you know, one of those ways, this is going to sound wonky, right? But like, one of those ways that we do that is, just starting a sentence without I, or sounding a little informal. Friendships are important to you, and without them, you're feeling vulnerable and blah blah blah. That's one of those ways that you can kind of categorize that, right? That's how they would be talked to by a human being. So I talked about being called a robot, right? Being called a bot, and there's a lot of anxiety on a new crisis chat or text volunteer advocate's point of view, as far as they want to make sure they sound human. And what does that even mean? And how do we make sure that we do sound less robotic and more human? So there's a number of pitfalls we fall into when we do this work. So we're going to go through those, and then we're going to find the antidote for each pitfall, which there is no antidote for a pitfall, but that's the metaphorical language we jumped on. We're not writers, so just be easy on us. So pitfall one is we don't incorporate ourselves, and that's a big deal, right? We may not feel it's okay to use I or we, especially when we're writing it down. It comes across a little easier because, again, when you're talking with someone in person or over the phone, you have a tone of voice, right? So when you're using an I or we statement in the tone of voice, with a tone of voice, they know that you're not trying to take the focus away from them and put it on yourself. But when you're engaging with someone online through chat or text, you're a lot more worried about, like, I don't want to keep talking about myself. All of these statements sound like it is coming from myself about myself, and I don't want to do that. They also don't have body language to work with or anything like that. But I'm here to tell you it's okay to use I or we statements in moderation. It sounds weird to say that, right? But it's okay to express your humanity over these conversations. It's honestly going to lead to better outcomes than if you went as hyper formal as possible. So, just little examples. I'm really concerned about you. Thank you so much for telling me about those thoughts. I know it can be hard to talk about. You're still referencing the person here, right? The focus is still on the client, but it shows that you're part of this conversation. You're a human being trying to share their pain with them. You want to match the language used by the visitor, try using the same terms. So if you notice they start saying mom a lot, you can start saying your mom really doesn't like your life choice, and that's really hard on you, right? If you formalize it out to mother, that sounds weird to them, right? That sounds like what a robot would do. Your mother, blah, blah, blah. So use the language that they use. Use the shortening. If they keep referring to their girlfriend as GF, shorten it. See how that goes. I'm not saying you like spam GF over and over, and you can still intersperse them maybe. One thing that I do sometimes is if I've used girlfriend in one sentence and I have another sentence that references her, I'll do one and then the other. That's how human beings talk, right? I already referenced girlfriend. I don't need to say girlfriend again. We already have the context. So in my text, I'll just put GF, and they know exactly what I'm talking about. And we can use intensifiers, right? So I hear that you feel so very hurt. Intensifiers are actually, I would say you kind of shy away from them sometimes over the phone and in person, but in chat and text, they can be very impactful. Again, the purpose here is you're making yourself a little more human. Who doesn't really use intensifiers is bots. They instead just use the exact same thing when they reflect, right? So you're intensifying to show that not only are you actively listening to what they're saying, you're understanding the meaning behind it, and you can go that one step further. You do want to do intensifiers more. You want to stay away from minimizers, which is you feel kind of hurt or stuff like that. Minimizers generally do not work out. They go across okay, or the person starts feeling like you're not actually taking the intensity of their emotion seriously. And then you want to use validation to show that you think what they're going through is normal. You're not alone. I'm here to listen. Or that makes sense, right? Just little things like that. Again, this is not new to you in the world of domestic violence. You probably do this all the time. However, this is absolutely something that you have to make sure that your advocates are pushing themselves to keep using when they're on online emotional support systems. Because again, my last point, and I'm going to keep repeating it, they're interacting with this technology way different than the other technologies they've interacted with as helpers. And so you cannot assume that everything will transfer one to one from their contacts in person or over the phone to these new contacts in chat and text. There will be some retraining of already established skills that you have to do because they just look different in this medium. I will try. We have 5 minutes, 4 minutes. I think I'm probably just going to leave it there. We'll go through the rest of the pitfalls next week, and then we'll transition into what the assessment of risk and safety looks like. So great. Well, then I will hopefully see everyone here next week at the same bat time, same bat station, 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I really look forward to kind of picking things up. Again, we're going to be talking more about kind of what the chat and text process looks like, its differences between phones and in-person contact, and then we'll dive into some other content as well next week. So thank you all for being a wonderful audience. I had a lot of fun today, and we'll talk soon.